Picture this dusty suburb of Phoenix, where the streets stretch like endless ribbons of asphalt under the relentless Arizona sun. The houses with identical terracotta roofs stand in neat rows like soldiers on parade, and the air always smells faintly of dry earth and chlorine from the swimming pools that everyone has. Henry Miller, a burly 42-year-old engineer with hands more accustomed to blueprints and tools than to fancy things, always loved these weekend golf outings with Matt Randall, his neighbor and the best friend you could wish for in a life like this. Matt, a charismatic realtor in his 50s with graying hair that only added to his charm, like some old Hollywood actor from a movie, always knew how to lighten the mood with a joke or a story about his practice of selling houses to people who didn't think they needed them. They met every 2 weeks at Desert Mirage Golf Club, a half-hour drive from their neighborhood, where the palm trees swayed lazily and the green lawns seemed like unreal oases in the desert. And today, on this Sunday afternoon in August 2025, with the temperature hovering over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, they were just finishing their 18th hole. Henry stood by the flag, squinting against the bright light reflecting off the white sand in the bunkers, his club still vibrating in his hands from the impact as the ball went right on target, rolling into the hole with that satisfying thud that always made him smile, as if the world had become a little simpler. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his polo shirt, the one Becky had bought him for his birthday a few months ago, light blue to match his eyes, she had said, and thought how nice it was to get away from the office where you spent your days working on bridges and pipelines, calculating the stresses and strains so that nothing would collapse. Matt, with his ever-present cigar in his mouth, though he didn't smoke it on the field, just chewed it for show, clapped him on the shoulder with a kind of strength that spoke of true friendship, not falsehood, and laughed his deep, booming laugh that echoed across the empty field. "Damn, Henry, you're on a roll today," Matt exclaimed, adjusting his cap with the logo of some elite golf club he must have visited during one of his business trips. "If I didn't know better, I'd think you were cheating. Or did your Becky teach you some secrets? She was always a sly fox, huh?" Henry grinned, feeling the muscles in his shoulders relax after a long game of 18 holes, each one a little adventure, a ball going into the saguaro bushes, a wind blowing it the wrong way, but in the end it all came down to that nice sense of accomplishment. He loved these conversations with Matt. They were like therapy, no therapists involved, just two guys talking about life in the hot sun, sweat running down their backs, the smell of freshly cut grass in the air, mixed with the coffee in their thermoses. "Oh, come on, Matt," Henry said, picking up his ball and dropping it into the bag on the cart. "Becky, she'd rather have me do yoga or something to relax my mind, as she says. No, it's just luck on my side today. And you? Tell me about that house deal in Scottsdale. You mentioned the client was a real piece of work." Matt slung his club over his shoulder, and they walked slowly toward the clubhouse, where air conditioning and cold beers awaited them at the bar, a tradition after every game without which nothing would seem complete. The sun was hot on his skin, but Henry didn't complain. He had grown up in Arizona, accustomed to the heat that seeped into every pore and made him appreciate the shade. Matt, walking alongside, began his story with that intonation that always captivated him. He was a master of storytelling, able to turn a banal house sale into an epic. "Oh, that lady Henry, she was one of those people who knows what she wants, but doesn't say it. She comes into the office, all designer, with a bag that costs more than my car, and says, 'I want a house with a view of the mountains, but not too close to the noise.' I show her options, and she keeps wincing, like I'm suggesting a cabin in the desert. Finally, after 3 looks, she takes the one with the heart-shaped pool, can you believe it? She says it's for romance. And her husband, he didn't even show up. He just signed checks over video. Women, man, they always keep us on our toes." Henry nodded, his legs a little tired. They had probably walked 10 kilometers on this course, where each hole was named after a local plant or animal, like coyote or cactus, and that added to the flavor. He thought of his Becky, the attractive housewife who was always waiting for him at home with dinner or just a smile that lit up their modest 2-bedroom suburban home with a small garden where she grew succulents because they didn't need much water in this drought. You're right, Matt, Henry said, pausing for a moment to tie a lace on his trainer. Becky is a bit of a mystery sometimes, too. She was looking rather thoughtful last night, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea and looking out of the window as if she could see something over the horizon. I asked her if she was all right, and she smiled and said, "Of course, dear, just thinking about Holly. Our daughter, has just come back from college for the holidays, and Becky is worried about how she'll fit in." Matt nodded, his eyes glittering with understanding under his cap. He'd been married to Pam for 25 years, and the woman, silent and watchful as a shadow in the corner of the room, had always seemed like an enigma to Henry, but Matt adored her. It was evident in the way he mentioned her in conversation, with a warmth that never faded. "Kids are a pain in the ass," Matt grumbled, brushing sand off his pants. "Ours are grown now, but Pam still wakes up sometimes in the night to check if they've written. And Holly's a smart girl, Henry. She'll handle it. You said it yourself, she's top of her class at her college. Speaking of wives, Pam made that chili you like last night. Maybe you'll come over for dinner next week? No big deal. Just sit in the backyard and look at the stars. They're brighter than anywhere else in Arizona." They walked to the clubhouse, where the air conditioning cooled them like an escape from hell, and Henry felt that slight satisfaction that always came after a good game, the body tired but the mind clear, like meditation. They sat at the bar and ordered pints of lager, and the conversation flowed on about work, about their neighbors, about how the prices of houses in their area were going up because of people like Matt, who knew all the secrets of the market. Henry told them about his latest project, a bridge over a canyon that had to be seismically controlled because Arizona, though a desert, sometimes shook, and Matt listened attentively, nodding as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. "You're a pillar of the community, Henry," Matt said, raising his glass. "Without people like you, we'd all be driving on potholes. Here's to friends." They clinked glasses, and the beer was cold, with foam that melted on his lips, and Henry thought how lucky he was to have such a life. A stable job, a loving wife, a daughter who was the pride of the family, and a friend with whom he could be himself. But somewhere deep down, beneath this contentment, a slight weariness stirred, not physical, but some kind of internal weariness, as if routine had accumulated, layer upon layer, and sometimes he caught himself thinking that the days were running together in one long, predictable stream. "You know, Matt," he said suddenly, looking into his glass where the bubbles were rising, "sometimes I wonder, what if we changed everything? I don't know, maybe take a vacation and go somewhere with Becky, to Europe or just to the mountains. She always dreamed of going to Italy, to those little streets in Tuscany with the wine and the olive groves." Matt leaned back in his chair, his face serious, but with that supportive twinkle in his eye. "Why not, Henry? Life is short, especially in our desert, where everything dries out so quickly. I went to Mexico with Pam last year, and it was like a second wind. Talk to Becky, she'll be all for it. She's not one to sit still, always up to something, rebuilding the garden, trying out new recipes. In fact, she called Pam the other day. They were talking about a picnic together. Women, they're always one step ahead of us." Henry smiled as he finished his beer and felt the sun begin to set outside, painting the sky the orange hues typical of Arizona, where sunsets are like paintings of drama. They paid, shook hands with the bartender, an old acquaintance named Juan, who always joked about their punches, and walked out to the parking lot where their cars waited, hot as ovens. "Until next time, buddy," Matt said, giving Henry a man hug and a slap on the back. "And don't forget about that dinner. Pam will love it." Henry climbed into his truck, a Ford F-150 that had served him faithfully for 5 years, and started the engine, the air conditioner kicking in immediately, blowing a chilly breeze. The drive home was familiar, down Highway 60, past strip malls and palm trees, where the traffic was light on this Sunday night, and the radio was playing an old rock song, Hotel California, that always reminded him of his youth. He thought of Becky, her smile, the way she greeted him at the door with a kiss, and of Holly, probably in her room, her nose in her laptop, studying biology. She wanted to be a doctor, and that made him proud. Their house was in a quiet neighborhood called Cactus Ridge, where neighbors knew each other by name, and in the evenings you could hear coyotes howling in the distance. Pulling up to the garage, Henry pressed the button on the remote, and the door swung open with a soft hum. He stepped out, his legs aching from walking, but overall feeling satisfied, like a job well done. The sun was setting, casting long shadows from the cacti in the garden that Becky loved to water in the morning. He entered the house through the kitchen, which smelled of freshly brewed coffee and something spicy. She was probably cooking dinner, maybe tacos or a steak on the grill. "Honey, I'm home," he called, kicking off his sneakers at the door, as he always did, to avoid getting sand in them. But instead of the usual, "Hello, honey," or footsteps, he heard silence, broken only by the ticking of the living room clock. Henry walked further into the living room, where the television was off and Holly had apparently gone to see a friend. She had mentioned something about meeting up. Becky stood by the window, her arms crossed over her chest, silhouetted by the sunset, and when she turned, Henry saw her eyes icy as a winter desert wind, without the warmth he was accustomed to. Her attractive face, with its high cheekbones and chestnut hair pulled back into a ponytail, seemed tense, as if she had been rehearsing this scene in her head all day. "Henry," she said quietly, but with a tone that made his heart skip a beat, "we need to talk." In that kitchen, where the air was always thick with the aroma of freshly ground coffee in the morning and the spices from the Mexican dishes that Becky loved to experiment with, cooking with a passion that was reminiscent of her roots in southern Arizona, where her grandmother had taught her to mix chili with corn so that every bite would explode on her taste buds, Henry stood frozen in the doorway, his golf bag still slung over his shoulder, the sweat from the heat outside mixing with the sudden chill inside that went straight to his bones, even though the air conditioning in the house was on full blast, humming quietly like a backdrop to a scene that seemed ripped from some bad dream. The sun was already setting outside, painting the sky those deep shades of orange and purple that always promise a cool night in Arizona after a hot day. But at that moment Henry felt time slow down. Every tick of the wall clock, the same cuckoo clock they'd bought at a fair in Tucson a couple of years ago, echoing in his ears, and Becky, his wife, the woman he'd shared his life with for 20 years, was standing there at the sink where she usually washed dishes with a smile, humming old 90s hits under her breath. But now her shoulders were tense like guitar strings about to break, and her eyes, usually warm as sand in the sun, were looking at him with that icy detachment that made his heart clench. "Becky, what's wrong?" Henry asked, trying to keep his voice level, as he always did when he sensed something was wrong, because he was the kind of man who preferred to solve problems logically, step by step, like in his engineering work, where every calculation had to be precise lest the structure collapse, and he set his bag on the floor, taking a step forward but not too close, instinctively sensing that the space between them had suddenly become a minefield. "You look, I don't know, like you've been waiting all day to say something important. Is Holly okay? She went to see a friend, right? Or was it about work? You know I'm always here to listen, honey." Becky turned fully toward him, her hands, usually so sure when she was kneading dough or ironing his shirts, now fiddling with the hem of her apron, the one with the cactus embroidery that Holly had given her for Mother's Day, and she opened her mouth, but the words didn't come right away. They stuttered, as if they were struggling inside her to get out, and Henry saw her lips tremble slightly, her eyes moving around the kitchen, to the refrigerator covered with magnets from their trips, to the table where there were still crumbs from the breakfast they had eaten together that morning, laughing at some joke about the weather. "Henry, you know how much I love you, don't you?" she began, her voice soft but cracked, like the desert earth after a long drought when the rain finally came too late, and she paused, looking at him as if seeking comfort in his eyes, those blue ones that always calmed her in difficult times. "I mean, all these years, ever since we met in college, remember that party by the lake where you saved me from that guy who talked too much, and we walked all night talking about the stars and how Arizona seemed endless. I always thought that our love was like those mountains on the horizon, strong, unwavering, even when the wind was blowing hard and sand was flying in your eyes." Henry nodded, but something inside him was tensing, like a spring in a machine that was about to snap because her words were too long, too full of memories, like she was trying to build a bridge to something bad, and he moved closer, resting his hand on the kitchen island where they usually drank coffee in the morning, discussing their plans for the day, and felt the coolness of the granite under his fingers, the one they had chosen together at the store, arguing over the color. "Of course I know, Becky," he said, trying to smile, but it came out crooked because the catch was in the air, like the smell of rain before a desert storm, when the sky darkens suddenly. "And I love you more than ever, but you scare me. What happened? Is it about Holly? Did she do something bad at college? Or, or is it about us? If I've done something wrong, just tell me straight out and I'll fix it. You know I don't like these riddles. They're like unsolved equations, hanging in my head and giving me no peace." She turned away for a moment, looking out the window where the sunset was now blood red, reflected in the neighbor's pool, and Henry saw her shoulders sag, as if the burden she was carrying had become too heavy, and she began to speak again, the words stumbling from one to the next like thoughts in a fever. "No, no, Holly's fine. She's so smart, our girl. Always been a copy of you. With all that logic and determination. Remember how she used to build bridges out of Lego when she was little and say she was going to be an engineer like Daddy. But this isn't about her, Henry, this is about me, about what I feel inside, and sometimes life seems so routine, like these streets in our suburb, all the same, day after day, the sun rising and setting, and I'm sitting at home waiting for you, waiting for Holly, and wondering if there's something more, something I've missed, like those trips we dreamed of, to Italy, to those hills with vineyards where the air smelled of basil and freedom, but we never got to go because of work and home and bills. And I love you, Henry, I really do, but sometimes love, it changes, or no, it doesn't change, but there's something else there, like the shade of a palm tree at noon, which lengthens and covers everything." Henry felt his heart beat faster, like an engine about to overheat, and he stepped closer. But he didn't touch her because the air between them seemed charged with electricity, like before a desert thunderstorm when lightning was about to strike. "Becky, you're talking in riddles," he said, his voice firmer, but with a tinge of worry he couldn't hide, because he was always level-headed but never cold, and memories of their life flashed through his mind. Their wedding in the little chapel in Phoenix, Holly's birth in that hospital where he'd held Becky's hand all night, their trips to the Grand Canyon where they'd stood on the edge, feeling tiny before eternity. "If this is about routine, let's change it up. Take a vacation, go anywhere. I'll talk to the boss tomorrow. But tell me exactly what's bothering you. Are you, are you unhappy with me? Is that what I think it is? No, wait, that sounds stupid. We've always been strong. We've been through everything together, the loss of your mother, my accident on the construction site 5 years ago when I broke my leg and you nursed me for weeks." Becky finally looked at him straight, tears glistening in her eyes like the raindrops on the leaves of the succulents in their garden that she had watered so carefully, and she spoke faster, her words tripping over each other like stones in a stream after a rainstorm. "Henry, I'm sorry. I don't know how to say this without hurting you, because you're the best man I've ever known, always so loyal, coming home on time, helping with dinner even when you're tired from those projects of yours where you're calculating all those bridges and pipes so the world doesn't collapse, and I appreciate that, I really do, but sometimes I feel empty, like in this desert around us where nothing grows without water, and I met someone. No, I didn't meet someone. It wasn't that simple. It happened by chance, like a sandstorm that comes in suddenly and covers everything. And I didn't mean to, I swear, but it happened, and now I can't pretend that everything is the same, because every time I look at you, I see this guilt, like a cactus thorn that digs into my skin and won't let me forget." Henry froze, her words hitting him like a golf club, hitting a ball, not into the hole, but into a bunker where the sand swallows everything, and he felt the world tilt, as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted, although earthquakes are rare in Arizona, but they happen sometimes, a reminder that nothing lasts forever. "What?" he said, his voice hoarse, like the throat that goes dry after a long game of golf in the sun. Are you? Are you kidding, Becky? This can't be true. We're, we're happy, aren't we? Who? When? This is crazy, honey. You're tired, maybe from the heat, or from Holly going off to college, an empty nest, as the psychologists say, but cheating? No, you're not like that. You've always been faithful. Remember how we swore to each other in that chapel, under that cross, that nothing would separate us. She shook her head, tears now streaming down her cheeks, leaving marks like streams in dry earth, and she continued, becoming even more confused, the words swirling like dust in a whirlwind. No, I'm not kidding, Henry. I wish it was a joke like the ones you tell after you play golf with Matt when you come home and laugh at your mistakes. But it's real, and I don't know how to explain it because it's not about you being bad, you're perfect, you always have been with your stability like the bridges you build are solid. But sometimes a person needs something wild like a coyote in the night that howls free, and it happened a few months ago or longer. I can't remember exactly. Time runs like days out here in this suburb where all the neighbors are smiling, but inside everyone has their own secrets, and I didn't mean to hurt you. But keeping it inside is like a poison that eats away at you from the inside, and now I'm telling you because I love you and I want us to. I don't know, maybe we'll get through this together, or I'm sorry, I'm confused. These are the wrong words. Henry took a step back, his hands clenched into fists, not from anger, but from shock that paralyzed him like a sudden cold shower after a hot day, and he looked at her, trying to see the lie, but there was only pain in her eyes, mixed with something else he couldn't make out. Becky, stop, he said, his voice shaking now like palm leaves in the wind. This isn't you talking, this is some kind of nightmare. Who, tell me, who is this bastard? One of the neighbors? From your yoga class? Or, wait, no, that's impossible. We sleep in the same bed every night, kiss goodbye every morning. How could you? And why now? After everything we've been through? This is crazy, honey. Let's sit down, have some tea, you'll calm down, and we'll figure it out. Maybe it's depression. I've read about women our age having a crisis, but cheating? No, I don't believe it. She came closer, reaching out her hand, but not touching him, her fingers hovering in midair as if afraid of getting burned, and continued, her voice quieter, but her words still tangled, intertwined with memories and excuses. Henry, please don't ask who, because it doesn't matter. It's not about him. It's about me, and how I lost myself in this housewife role, where the days are like carbon copies of each other. The laundry, the cooking, the waiting, and then suddenly someone comes along who looks at you in a new way, like you're not just a wife and a mother, but a woman full of fire, like those sunsets here in Phoenix that light up the sky. And I gave in, once, then again, and each time I thought I'd stop, but I couldn't, because it was like a drink of water in the desert, refreshing. But now I see how it's destroying us, and I regret it, I swear. But you can't bring it back, like you can't bring back the rain that's already evaporated. Henry felt the anger rise, mixed with disbelief, like a storm in a canyon where the wind howls and blows sand, blinding his eyes, and he turned, walking around the kitchen, his footsteps echoing on the tiles they had laid together 10 years ago, laughing at their mistakes. It doesn't matter, he cried, his voice louder but still controlled, for he was level-headed, not the shouting type. Becky, this ruins everything. How can you say you love me and yet cheat? For how long? Months? Years? And you kept quiet, smiling at me, making dinner like nothing happened. This is betrayal, honey, pure betrayal. I don't believe it. This is a dream. I'm going to wake up any minute, and we'll laugh about it. Tell me this is a joke, please. But she didn't say anything. Instead, she sat down at the table, her head in her hands, and cried quietly, her shoulders shaking like leaves in the wind, and Henry stood looking at her, feeling the world crumbling like a bridge under too much weight, and questions swirling in his head. Who, why, how to go on living in this house where everything reminded him of their life together. Henry, she whispered through her tears, forgive me, but I can't lie anymore. It's the truth, and now it's up to you to decide, because I love you, but I'm broken inside, like those old clay pots in our garden that crack in the sun. He didn't answer right away, he just stood there, looking out the window, where night was already falling on the suburbs, and coyotes in the distance were beginning to howl like harbingers of trouble, and in that moment Henry knew that this was only the beginning, that the secret Becky was keeping who this man was yet to be revealed. but for now everything was covered in shadow like a desert under the moon. Henry felt the walls of their tidy kitchen, where every object was steeped in the years of their life together, from the fridge magnets collected on trips to national parks to the faded cactus-patterned curtain that Becky had chosen so lovingly closing in around him, as if the air had become thick, sticky as tar, and he couldn't breathe. Her words, "I met someone," buzzed in his head like a swarm of disturbed wasps in the Arizona desert silence, and each syllable was a blow that shattered everything he had thought was solid, like the bridge he had designed to the millimeter to withstand any storm. He couldn't stay here, in this space where Becky stood at the table, her face, still beautiful despite the tears, twisted with pain and guilt, and her hands, which he loved to hold, now felt strange, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who had invaded their home. "I have to go out," he said, his voice low, almost growling, and he turned toward the door that led to the backyard without looking at her, because one look would break his restraint, and Henry Miller, engineer, father, husband, always prided himself on holding himself together like a steel frame that didn't bend under pressure. He stepped outside, and the hot Phoenix evening air hit him like a wave, but even the heat, laced with the smell of dry earth and neighbors' barbecues, couldn't keep the chill out of his gut. Their backyard, a small oasis of neatly trimmed grass, and the bed of succulents Becky had so lovingly watered, was lit by the last rays of sunset, and the shadows of the palm trees that lined the fence stretched in long stripes, like fingers pointing at him with accusation. Henry walked to the lounge chair by the pool, the same one where he and Becky sometimes sat in the evenings, sipping wine and discussing future plans, the trip to Italy she was dreaming about, or remodeling the kitchen to make a bigger island, and collapsed into it, feeling the plastic creak under his weight. His hands were shaking, and he clenched them into fists, trying to calm the storm that was raging inside him, like a sandstorm that comes suddenly and covers everything around. He closed his eyes, and memories began to play in his head like stills from an old movie, not the warm ones of him and Becky laughing at Matt's jokes at the Randalls' barbecue, or of Holly, as a toddler, running around this yard with a toy stethoscope, pretending to be a doctor. No, his mind was clinging to other moments now, ones he had previously dismissed as tiredness or routine. Becky's late nights, she'd said she was staying late at yoga or meeting a friend, but now he remembered how rarely she'd mentioned those friends' names, how evasive she'd been when he'd asked where she'd been. "Oh, just coffee with Sarah," she'd say, but who was Sarah? He'd never met Sarah, never seen her at their parties, never heard Becky call her. Or those evenings when she sat with her phone, staring at the screen, and quickly put it away when he walked into the room, smiling that forced smile that now seemed like a mask to him. And her sudden mood swings: in the morning she could be tender, hugging him while he drank coffee, and by evening she would become irritable, brushing off his questions like annoying flies, or retreating to the bedroom, saying she was tired. Henry opened his eyes to the darkening sky, where the first stars were already showing like tiny pinpricks of light in black fabric, and felt an emptiness growing in his chest, like that desert outside the city where nothing grows without water. How could I not have noticed? He thought, and the words were bitter, like coffee left on the stove too long. He had always considered himself observant. It was necessary in his work to notice the smallest details in the plans, so that the bridge would not collapse, so that the pipes would withstand the pressure. But at home, with Becky, he was blind, as if the desert sand were in his eyes. He remembered one evening, 3 months ago, when she had come home late, her hair disheveled, and smelled of some unfamiliar perfume, not her usual lavender, but something sharp and musky. He had asked her where she had been, and she had laughed, too loudly, and said, "Oh, just a party at a friend's. You don't know her, darling, just a ladies' night." He believed because he wanted to believe, because Becky was his anchor, his home, his safe haven in a world where everything else could be chaotic. Now, sitting in the lounge chair, he began to fit the pieces together like the pieces of a puzzle he'd previously refused to see. The messages on her phone that she'd quickly delete, saying they were spam. Her sudden trips into town, supposedly to get groceries, only to return empty-handed, explaining that she'd forgotten to buy what she needed. Or how she'd started wearing more makeup, even to the grocery store, wearing dresses she'd previously only pulled out for special occasions, low cut and showing off the figure he'd always thought was perfect, even after Holly was born. Henry felt the anger flare up again, but now it was mixed with pain, like salt in a wound, and he stood up, pacing the yard in circles, his sneakers crunching on the grass, coyotes howling in the distance, their voices cutting through the silence like knives. He stopped at the bed of succulents that Becky loved so much, agaves, echeverias, the little cacti she called her babies because they didn't require much care, but still bloomed despite the heat. He remembered how she had stood there watering them once, 6 months ago, and suddenly she had cried, for no reason, just watching the water run into the dry earth, and he had hugged her then, thinking it was because of Holly, who had just left for college. Empty nest, huh? He had asked then, and she had nodded. But now he realized it wasn't just Holly. It was her secret, her shadow, which even then was lengthening, like those palm trees at sunset, covering their lives. Henry sat back down heavily in the chaise longue, and his gaze fell on the Randall house, over the fence, where the lights in the windows were cozy, and he imagined Matt and Pam sitting at dinner, maybe laughing at a joke, as they always did. Matt, his best friend, with his loud laugh and stories about selling houses, and Pam, silent but always observant, with eyes that seemed to see more than she said. Henry wondered suddenly if Pam knew anything. She and Becky often had coffee together, discussing gardening or books, and Pam, with her quiet manner, might notice changes in Becky that he, Henry, had missed. He remembered how at the Randalls' last barbecue, a couple of weeks ago, Pam had looked at Becky longer than usual when she was laughing too loudly at something Matt had said, and Henry had thought at the time that Pam was just tired, but now the look seemed meaningful to him, like a signal he hadn't deciphered. "This can't be true," he whispered to himself, but the words rang hollow as echoes in a canyon. He tried to convince himself that it was a mistake, that Becky was just confused, that this was a temporary insanity, like a mirage in the desert that vanished the closer you got to it. But the details, the little dominoes, fell one after another in his mind, forming a chain he couldn't ignore. The late calls she took in the other room, her sudden passion for new hobbies, yoga, ceramics, even that painting class she went to on Thursdays, but never brought home a single painting. The friend who didn't exist, he thought, and the thought was like a bolt of lightning splitting dry wood. He recalled asking once who ran the group, and she had responded evasively, "Oh, just a local artist, nothing special," and changed the subject by suggesting they watch a film. Henry stood up again, unable to sit still, and walked to the fence that separated their yard from the empty lot behind the house, where the real desert began, with its thorny bushes and sand that crunched underfoot. He looked into the darkness, where the stars now shone brightly like shards of broken glass, and he felt his world collapsing like dominoes, where one false move and everything falls. He wanted to go back into the house, grab Becky by the shoulders, demand her name, know who this man was who had stolen his wife, his life, but at the same time he was afraid of the truth, because the truth was like cactus thorns, it hurt, and the wound did not heal quickly. He remembered their wedding, Becky standing in her white dress, so simple but so perfect, and the way she had looked at him as they danced under the stars in that little garden in Phoenix, and whispered, "You're my home, Henry, always." How could that home be a cage for her? He remembered Matt, not yet gray but already charismatic, winking at him at that wedding and saying, "You've got a treasure, buddy, hold on tight." And he had, or thought he had, but now the treasure was slipping through his fingers like sand. Henry turned toward the house, where the kitchen light was still on, and Becky was probably still sitting there, head down, waiting for him to come back. He didn't know what he would say when he got back, didn't know if he would be able to speak at all, but he knew one thing: she had been having an affair for a long time, months, maybe even years, and the thought was like a knife that sank deeper with every step he took back toward the house. He paused at the door, his hand hovering over the knob, and somewhere in the night, the coyote howled again, its voice full of loneliness, and Henry felt like the sound was an echo of his own heart. The morning in suburban Phoenix began with that deceptively soft light that bathes the desert before the sun turns everything into a frying pan. Henry woke up on the living room couch where he had spent the night, unable to return to his and Becky's bedroom, where the bed, covered in the geometric diamond-patterned bedspread they had picked out together at a store in Mesa, now felt like a minefield of memories of her warmth, her breath against him, her hand on his chest. He lay staring at the ceiling, where the fan spun lazily, casting shadows like slowly falling dominoes, and tried to understand how his life, as orderly as the bridge plans he had spent years drawing, could crack like the parched earth of the desert. Becky had not come out to him that morning, and he had not heard her footsteps in the kitchen, where the usual sounds of pots clanking or coffee hissing in the coffee maker were. The silence in the house was heavy, like the air before a storm, and Henry, pulling on yesterday's polo shirt, the same blue one she had given him, went out onto the porch to get some fresh air before the heat enveloped everything. He sat on the steps, looking out at their street, Cactus Ridge, where the houses stood in neat rows like soldiers, and the palms and yucca trees lining the sidewalks swayed ever so slightly in the morning breeze. Across the street, the Randall house looked as usual, a neatly trimmed lawn, Matt's white SUV in the driveway, and the curtains on the windows that Pam, with her silent meticulousness, always kept perfectly clean. Henry found himself staring at the house for too long, as if trying to see something beyond those windows, something that might hold answers. Matt, his best friend, with whom he'd spent the day yesterday on the golf course, laughing at misses and sipping beers in the clubhouse. Matt, with his loud laugh that echoed and his charisma that made people sign contracts on houses without even thinking. Matt, who was always there at barbecues, at Christmas when he and Pam brought their signature chili, at parties in their backyard where he would joke with Becky, hugging her a little longer than necessary or winking when he said things like, "Becky, you look like you just stepped off the cover of a magazine today." Henry felt something tighten inside him, like a spring about to snap. He began to remember, replaying in his mind moments that had once seemed innocent, just part of their friendship, part of how Matt had always been the life of the party. But now those memories took on a different color, as if someone had spilled dirt on a blank page. He remembered how at one of their barbecues last summer, Matt had put his hand on Becky's waist as they stood at the grill, discussing how to cook their steaks the best. Henry had simply smiled then, thinking that it was just Matt, like that, always a little too close to people, with his grand gestures and loud voice. But now he remembered how Becky hadn't pulled away, just laughed, her cheeks slightly flushed, and how Pam, sitting at the table with her glass of wine, had watched them with her usual silent attentiveness, her eyes dark and deep as wells, following their every movement, but she had said nothing. Only later, when he and Henry were alone, helping to clear the dishes, had Pam said something that had seemed odd to him at the time. Sometimes trust is just the absence of facts. He had laughed at the time, thinking it was just her way of speaking in riddles, but now it sounded like a warning he had ignored. He stood up, his blood pounding in his temples, and walked down the driveway to his truck, which was parked outside the garage. He had no intention of driving, just moving so his thoughts wouldn't stagnate like water in a puddle after a rare rain. But moving didn't help. The images kept popping up like bubbles in a soda. Matt, who always knew how to make Becky laugh, how to make her eyes light up when he told stories about his clients or joked about her cooking experiments. Matt, who had called a couple of times late at night, ostensibly to discuss his golf plans with Henry, but his voice was too cheerful, and he could sometimes hear Becky laughing in the background when she should have been home and not at the Randalls. Or the time Henry came home from work earlier than usual to find Matt in their living room, sitting on the couch with a cup of coffee, and Becky standing at the kitchen island mixing muffin batter, and they both went silent when he walked in, like he was interrupting something important. "Just stopping by to talk about the new property in Scottsdale," Matt had said, but his smile was a little too wide, and Becky had quickly turned back to the stove. Henry paused by the car, his hand on the hot hood, already warm in the morning sun, and felt suspicion coursing through his veins like poison. Could it be Matt? His best friend, with whom he had shared beer, laughter, memories of their youth, when he and Becky and Matt and Pam were just starting out in this suburb, buying houses across the street from each other, dreaming of a future where their children would play together. Matt, who had been the best man at their wedding, who had christened Holly, who had always said, "Henry, you are my brother, not by blood, but by life." It seemed impossible, like a bridge built without a foundation. But the more Henry thought about it, the more details emerged, like mud after a rain that shows through a clear surface. He remembered how, at their last golf game, just yesterday, Matt had mentioned Becky with a strange intonation when he was talking about her gardening. "Your Becky, Henry, she's like those cacti, pretty but with thorns if you get too close." Henry had just laughed at the time, thinking it was another joke, but now he saw something more in the words, as if Matt was testing him, seeing if he would notice something. And Pam, the looks he caught at parties when Becky and Matt were joking, standing a little closer to each other than they should have been. Pam, who was always silent, but whose eyes seemed to see everything that was going on around her. Henry remembered another moment, a few months ago, when he and Becky had been at the Randalls for dinner and Pam, pouring wine, had looked over at Becky and Matt, who were arguing about something insignificant, and her hand had shaken slightly, spilling a few drops onto the tablecloth. At the time, he'd thought she was just tired, but now the gesture seemed like a signal, as if Pam knew something but couldn't or wouldn't say it. He walked back to the porch, sitting down again, and his gaze fell on Becky's flower bed, where the succulents stood in perfect order, like the life she had so carefully constructed, or so he thought. Now he saw cracks in the picture, like the earth after a drought, and each crack led to Matt. He remembered Matt helping Becky carry a heavy tray of turkey one Thanksgiving last year, and their fingers had brushed briefly, and she had smiled at him, and he had winked, and Henry had simply thought it was friendly warmth. But now he saw those touches, those glances, like the mud that seeps onto a golf course after a rain, ruining the perfect greens. Henry felt the anger he had suppressed yesterday return, but now it was sharp as a blade, and aimed not just at Becky, but at Matt as well. He wanted to walk across the street, knock on their door, look Matt in the eye, and ask him point blank, "Is it you? Is it you who destroyed my family?" But he knew he couldn't, not now, not without proof, because Matt was his friend, and friendships, like bridges, don't crumble without a reason. Or do they? He remembered Pam's words. Sometimes trust is just the absence of facts. And now they sounded like a death sentence, as if she knew the truth was out there, but didn't want to say it. As the sun rose higher and the heat began to settle over the suburbs like a blanket, Henry sat looking at the Randall house and felt suspicion growing like a weed in the cracks of the asphalt. He didn't know how to continue this day, how to get back into the house where Becky might still be sitting in the kitchen, or how to meet Matt at his next golf game without seeing betrayal in every move he made. But he knew one thing for sure: the truth, like sand in the desert, always came out, and he would find it, even if it burned like the sun over Phoenix. Henry stood on the porch, feeling the early Phoenix sun begin to burn his skin, as if to remind him that nothing stayed soft for long in this desert. His gaze was still fixed on the Randall house across the street, where Matt's white SUV gleamed in the driveway, mocking his suspicions that now buzzed in his head like a swarm of disturbed bees. He couldn't go back into the house, where the silence of the kitchen, saturated with Becky's confession from the night before, suffocated him like the hot air before a sandstorm. Instead, his feet carried him, as if of their own accord, toward the garage, the same one where he kept his tools, his old golf clubs, and the boxes of things he and Becky had never unpacked since moving into the house 15 years ago. The garage was his sanctuary, a place where he would fix shelves or tinker with his car when his thoughts needed to be organized, like blueprints before a project was due. But today he wasn't going there for tools. He was going there for something elusive, for a truth he felt was hiding somewhere among those dusty boxes and the smell of old oil. The garage door creaked as he opened it, and light poured in, highlighting motes of dust dancing in the air like tiny ghosts of the past. It was hot inside, despite the early hour, and it smelled of metal and wood and something else, faint but familiar, like an echo of memory. He walked over to a workbench in the corner, littered with old nuts and bolts and screwdrivers and a couple of empty beer cans he'd forgotten to throw out after his last game of golf with Matt. There was a glass on the table, an ordinary glass tumbler, the kind they usually kept in the kitchen, but something about it made Henry freeze. He picked it up, holding it up to the light coming through the small window above the workbench, and noticed a lipstick mark on the rim, bright and red, like blood on sand. His heart skipped a beat. Becky had always favored neutrals, pinks and peaches, what she called natural, to blend in with their quiet suburban neighborhood. This red was foreign, flamboyant, like the dress she wore to parties, but then stopped wearing, saying she outgrew it. He turned the glass over in his hands, his fingers shaking, and tried to remember. Maybe it was an old shade of hers. She'd mentioned once that she'd worn bright lipstick when she was younger. When she was still feisty, she joked. But that was before Holly, before their life in Cactus Ridge, before she'd become a stay-at-home mom whose days revolved around cleaning and gardening and dinner. He set the glass down, but his eye caught something else, the corner of an old smartphone poking out from under a rag on the shelf. It was one of those phones Becky had stopped using a couple of years ago when she'd gotten a new one, citing that the old one was too buggy. Henry had never been one to poke around in his wife's things. He trusted her the way you trust a bridge you designed. But now, with that glass in his head and her confession still burning like hot sand beneath his feet, he couldn't stop. He picked up the phone, dusty and cracked, and turned it on, not expecting it to work. But the battery, surprisingly, still held a charge, and the screen lit up, showing an old background, a photo of him and Becky at the Grand Canyon, laughing, the wind blowing through her hair. Henry felt a pang of pain, but pushed it away, opening the menu. Messages. Most of them were deleted, but he knew that even deleted messages could sometimes be recovered, thanks to a coworker who had once shown him how to pull data off a damaged phone for a project. He plugged the phone into his laptop, which always sat in the garage for drawings, and fired up an old data recovery program he downloaded last year when Holly had accidentally deleted her school notes. Henry stood there staring at the glass while the program ran, his thoughts swirling like a desert dust storm. The lipstick. The smell in the garage, he suddenly realized what it was. Not just oil or dust, but something sweet and musky, like the perfume he'd smelled on Becky a few months ago when she'd come home late from a friend's party. He'd asked her what it was, and she'd waved it off as something new, a sample from the store, but he'd never noticed it again. Or had he? He remembered going into the Randall house to pick up Matt before golf, and there'd been a similar scent in the air, but he'd thought it was Pam, even though Pam always smelled light and floral, like her garden. The software on the laptop beeped, and Henry, his heart pounding like he'd been running a marathon, opened the recovered files. Messages, dozens, hundreds, but most were old, from Holly, from himself, from numbers with no names. But one contact stood out, just the letterum. Henry felt the blood drain from his face and clicked through the chain of messages. They were short, but each word was like a hammer hitting a nail, driving the truth deeper into his mind. Sedona this weekend? Same hotel, Canyon View Room. Becky, I'm not sure Henry will be home, but I'll think about it. You always think and then come. I know you can't resist. Henry froze, feeling the world around him shrink to this screen, to these words that burned into his eyes. Sedona. He and Becky had been there a couple of times when Holly was little, stayed in a little hotel with red rocks outside the window, where she said she felt as free as a bird. But that was years ago. He scrolled on, each message like a new thorn digging into his skin. Your dress yesterday, damn, Becky. You know how to drive me crazy. Becky, stop it, you talk too much. But, thank you. I love it when you blush. Your body is like those rocks in Sedona. It's impossible to look away. Henry threw the phone down on the table as if it had burned his hands, and the lipstick glass fell, shattering on the concrete floor with a sharp clink that echoed in the empty garage. Matt. It had to be him. Who else? His best friend, the man with whom he'd shared beer, laughter, memories of golf, of sitting in the backyard with Becky and Pam looking at the stars. Matt, who'd held Becky a little longer than necessary, who'd looked at her with that twinkle in his eye that Henry had once mistaken for friendly warmth. He remembered Matt mentioning Sedona once, saying he'd been there for work, showing a house to some rich Californians. Henry hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now the dates matched. It had been the same weekend Becky had said she was going to visit a friend in Tucson. He leaned against the wall, feeling the cold concrete on his back through his shirt, and tried to breathe evenly, the way he did on the golf course before a tough shot, when he had to concentrate to get the ball in the hole. But he couldn't concentrate. His thoughts were tangled like the wires in the old generator he'd once fixed in the garage. He remembered Becky coming back from that trip to Tucson one time, her eyes shining, saying the fresh air had done her good, but the car smelled of the same musky perfume, and he'd found a long dark hair on the seat, not hers, not brown, almost black, like Pam's. Or was it? He'd dismissed it then, thinking it was from Holly or her friend, but now it all fit together like a blueprint, each line leading to an inevitable conclusion. Henry picked up the shards of glass, feeling the glass cut into his fingers, but ignoring the pain. He didn't know what to do with this truth that now lay before him like broken glass on the floor. Should he go to Matt, grab him by the collar of his expensive shirt, and demand an explanation? Or should he go back to Becky, show her the phone, ask how she could lie to him, smile at him, cook him dinner, sleep next to him while her mind was on someone else? He felt like an engineer whose bridge had collapsed under the weight of the truth, and now he stood in the rubble, unsure of how to put it back together. He walked out of the garage, leaving his phone on the table, and looked at the Randalls' house. The light in their kitchen was on Pam, probably, making breakfast, or Matt, sipping his morning coffee and reading the real estate news. Henry felt the anger and hurt mixing like sand and wind in a storm, and he knew he couldn't just stand there. He had to know more, had to see Matt, hear his voice, look him in the eyes to see if he was lying like Becky had. But for now, he just stood there, looking at their house, and somewhere in the distance, the coyotes began to howl again, their voices a reminder that nothing stayed hidden forever in the desert. Henry stood in the garage, staring at the broken shards of glass that now lay on the concrete floor like the shards of his own life, shattered by a truth that was too sharp to ignore, and the air here, thick with dust, and that musky scent that now seemed like poison, choked him, making his heart pound as if he had just run a marathon on the hot asphalt of Phoenix, where every step left a trail of sweat and regret. He couldn't go back to the house, where Becky was probably still sitting in the kitchen, staring into her long, cold cup of tea, or maybe gone to the bedroom to hide from the storm she had caused with her words, her actions, her secrets that were now spilling out like water from a cracked dam, drenching everything. Instead, his gaze fell on the house across the street, on the cozy facade of the Randalls, the curtains fluttering gently from the air conditioning, and he thought of Pam, that quiet, observant woman who had always seemed like Matt's shadow to him, with her eyes that saw more than she said and her way of staying silent in company, but occasionally dropping phrases that stuck in your head like cactus spines in your skin. He remembered her words, "Sometimes trust is just the absence of facts," and now they sounded not like random wisdom, but like the key to a lock he had just opened, and he knew he had to talk to her, not Matt, who would probably laugh it off or lie with that charismatic smile of his, but Pam, because if anyone knew the truth, it was her, the woman who had shared a bed and dinner and silence with the traitor. He walked out of the garage without locking the door and crossed the street, feeling the sun already hot on the top of his head, even though it was early morning, and the air was filled with the smell of freshly cut grass from his neighbor's lawn, which usually calmed him, but now only irritated him, reminding him of the normal life he no longer had. The Randall house looked the same as always, with its white picket fence and the flowers in the beds that Pam had planted with such care as if each petal were part of her own soul, and he knocked on the door, not too loudly but loud enough to be heard, and waited, sweat trickling down his back, his thoughts swirling like a dust storm in a canyon. The door opened, and there stood Pam, in her usual clothes, a light floral dress that made her look like she belonged in her garden, and her face, usually as calm as the surface of a swimming pool on a windless day, was now filled with surprise mixed with something else. He couldn't quite place pity, maybe, or relief. "Henry," she said quietly, her voice like the rustle of leaves in the wind, soft but with a cautious edge that was always present in her speech. as if she were weighing each word on an invisible scale. Is something wrong? You look, I don't know, like you haven't slept all night. Matt just left for a client meeting, but I can call him if you need him. Henry shook his head, feeling a lump in his throat that made it hard to speak, but he forced himself to, because silence was impossible now, like stopping a sandstorm that had already begun. No, Pam, I didn't come for Matt, he said, his voice hoarse, like someone shouting for so long in the desert, where the echoes came back distorted. I wanted to talk to you. Can I come in? It's, it's important, and I don't know who else to share it with, but you, because you've always been the one who sees things for what they are, without the jokes and distractions like Matt. She paused for a moment, her eyes dark and piercing as they slid over his face, as if reading the whole story he had not yet told, and then she nodded, stepping aside. Sure, come in, Henry. Let's go into the kitchen. I was just making coffee strong, just the way you like it, with that Arizona blend Matt brings back from his trips. Come sit at the table, and I'll pour us both a cup, and you can tell me what's bothering you, because I can tell this isn't just a neighbor's visit, it's something deep, like those canyons we all used to go to a couple of years ago, remember, when Holly was a teenager and complained about the heat. They walked into the kitchen, which was a mirror image of their own granite countertops, light wood cabinets, and a window overlooking the backyard, where Pam grew her roses and succulents, which always bloomed more vibrantly than Becca's, as if she were putting some of her untapped energy into them. Henry sat at the table, feeling the chair creak beneath him, and watched as Pam poured coffee into two mugs, one that said, "Best Mom Ever," a gift from their son, Chris, who now lived in California, working in it and rarely visited, but always called on Sundays. She set the mug in front of him, sat across from him, and her hands, thin and manicured, curled around her cup, as if seeking support. "So what's the matter, Henry?" she asked, her voice level, but with that wariness that said she already knew, and her eyes never leaving his face as if she were waiting for him to open the door behind which the truth was hidden. "Is it about Becky? Or about work? You know, I don't like to pry into other people's affairs, but we've been neighbors for so many years, almost family, and if I can help, I will, because living in this suburb, with its sun and quiet, sometimes hides such storms inside people that it's better to share than to keep them inside." Henry took a sip of his coffee, the hot liquid burning his throat, but it was better than the pain inside him, and he looked at her directly, deciding not to beat around the bush, because the time for hints was past, just like the time for trust was past. Pam, Becky, she confessed yesterday, to cheat, said it had been going on for months, maybe longer, but she wouldn't say a name, just that it was someone I knew, and now I found proof, messages on an old phone with an M in it and mentions of Sedona and meetings and things I don't want to repeat, and I think it's Matt. You're Matt, my friend. Tell me I'm wrong, please tell me this is bullshit, because if it's true, then our whole world, this street, these barbecues, these golf games, it's all a lie, like a mirage in the desert that disappears the closer you get. Pam froze, her face as pale as sand under the moon, and she looked down into her cup, where the coffee was swirling in a little vortex from her shaking hand, and silence hung in the kitchen, heavy as the air before a rain that rarely comes in Arizona, but when it comes it washes everything away. Then she looked up, and there was a mixture of sadness and determination in her eyes, like someone who has been carrying a burden for a long time and is finally ready to let it go. "You know it was Matt, don't you, Henry?" she whispered, her voice quiet, but the words hitting like thunder in a dry storm, and she didn't look away, holding on to him like an anchor in a storm. "I saw you looking at our house this morning, standing on the porch, and I knew you'd figured it out. I've known for a long time, probably 2 years, maybe more, but I kept quiet because we have Chris, our son. He was just starting his life out there in San Francisco, and if it had come out, the scandal, the divorce, it would have broken him. He'd always idolized his father, seen Matt as a hero, a realtor who could sell a house to anyone, with his smile and his stories, and I didn't want Chris to know that his hero was just a man with weaknesses, with the secrets that break families." Henry felt the world tilt, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. though earthquakes were rare in Phoenix, and he stared at her, trying to process the words she spoke as calmly as if she were talking about the weather, but with a depth that betrayed years of silence. "You knew," he said, his voice growing louder, not with anger, but with shock, like a river after a rainstorm. 2 years, and you didn't say anything. Pam, we're friends, we're neighbors, hell, we're like family, and you watched this happen, like Matt and Becky, and you said nothing. Why? For Chris? But what about me? About Holly? She's just starting college, and if this came out, it would break her, and she adores Matt, calls him her uncle, and Becky is her mother, her perfection, and now this. How could you keep it all inside? Look at us at those dinners. Smile when they exchanged glances, and not say anything. Pam sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the burden she was carrying was lightened by sharing it, and she stood up, walking over to the cabinet above the sink where she kept spices and old recipes, and pulled out a folder plain, white, unmarked, but with a heaviness that spoke of its contents. "I'm not proud of this, Henry," she said, sitting back down and putting the folder on the table, but not opening it right away, as if giving him time to prepare. "I found these letters by accident, a couple of years ago, when I was cleaning out Matt's computer. He asked me to delete old files because he was complaining about the speed, and there were these printouts that he must have forgotten to delete, emails, correspondence with Becky, where they planned meetings, talked about feelings, about how tired they were of the routine of our life here in this suburb where the days blend together like sand in a desert. I read them, and the world collapsed, like those old bridges you talk about when they can't bear the weight. But I kept quiet because I loved Matt, despite everything. He was my husband of 25 years, Chris's father, and I thought it would pass, like a storm that comes and goes, leaving only memories. And Chris, he was just going through a breakup with a girl at the time. He was in depression, and if I told him, it would finish him off. But now that you've come, I see that it's time, because the truth always comes out like water from the ground in the desert, and it's better that you hear it from me than from someone else." She opened the folder and Henry saw a stack of papers, email printouts, with dates that went back 2 years, and the words on them were knives, cutting into his heart. "Love your touch, Matt. Meet me in Sedona while Henry is at work. Your wife won't know, she's too busy with the garden." He flipped through them quickly, feeling the tears sting his eyes, but not letting them fall because he was a man, an engineer, someone who held everything in himself, like steel in a structure. How did you live with that?" he asked, his voice shaking like leaves in the wind before a storm. Looking at Becky when she came over for coffee, smiling at her, knowing she was sleeping with your husband, and at me when Matt and I were playing golf, making jokes about wives, and he was damn Pam. This is a betrayal not just of me, but of you, of all of us. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you tell me sooner, so I could stop this before it was too late?" Pam took his hand across the table, her fingers cold despite the heat outside, and she squeezed them as if transferring some of her power, the quiet power that had kept her silent for years. "Because love isn't just joy, Henry. It's the pain you endure for the people you love," she said, her voice softer, but with the depth that spoke of nights spent in tears. "I loved Matt, I still do, despite everything, because he's not a villain, he's just weak, like so many men are when routine eats them up, and Becky. She was alone, with Holly at college, and I saw the way she looked at Matt, with a sparkle she didn't have when she looked at you. I'm not making excuses for them, I am, but I understand, because life here in this suburb, with its identical days, its sun that beats down on everything, can break anyone. I kept quiet for Chris, yes, but for all of us, if I had spoken, families would have fallen apart, Holly would have suffered, you would have lost a friend, and I would have lost a husband. But now that Becky has confessed, I see that silence has only prolonged the agony, like a drought that lasts for months before the rain comes. Take these printouts, Henry, read them if you like, or burn them, but know the truth before you make a decision, divorce, forgiveness, whatever. You deserve it, because you are a good man, always have been, with your loyalty, like the bridges you build, strong and reliable. Henry picked up the folder, feeling its weight as if it were made of lead, and looked at Pam, seeing her not just as a neighbor now, but as an ally in this nasty game where everyone was the victim. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice growing quieter, as if the strength was draining with each word. "Confront Matt, tell Becky I know, or just leave this house, this suburb where everything seems perfect but is a lie on the inside. And you'll stay with him, after everything?" Pam smiled sadly, her eyes glistening with tears, which she quickly blinked away, as if she didn't want to show weakness. "I don't know, Henry, honestly," she said, letting go of his hand and leaning back in her chair. "I've thought about it at night, when Matt was asleep next to me and I could hear him breathing, remembering those letters, and I've asked myself if I can forgive, or if it's better to leave, to start over, maybe move in with Chris, or just stay here in this house with my garden, where the flowers don't betray you. But the decision is mine, as it is yours. Confront me if you're ready, but be careful. Matt is cunning. He can deny everything, or turn it out as if it was a mistake, a fleeting weakness. And Becky, she loves you, I know. I've seen the way she looks at you sometimes, with a warmth that she doesn't have in her looks at Matt. It's passion, Henry, not love, and passion passes like an Arizona sunset, beautiful but short-lived. Think of Holly, of yourself, and if you need to, come to me, we'll talk some more, because now we are in this together, in this unpleasant union, where the truth has bound us more tightly than years of neighborliness." They sat there for a long time, drinking coffee that had grown cold, talking not about betrayal, but about life, about children, about plans that had never come to fruition, and Henry felt the pain ease a little, thanks to Pam, this quiet woman who was stronger than he thought, and her words, her printouts, were like a light at the end of a tunnel, or maybe like a star in the Arizona night sky, showing the way in the darkness. But he knew that this was only the beginning, that there were conversations and tears and decisions ahead, and this suburb, with its sun and silence, would never be the same again. Henry came home with Pam's folder, clutching it so tightly that the edges of the crumpled paper dug into his palms, leaving tiny marks like the first cracks in the foundations that he, as an engineer, always checked with meticulous precision to avoid disaster. But now disaster had happened, and his home, his life, his marriage, all of it was like a bridge being washed away by a river of betrayal, and he was not going to stand by and watch it all fall apart. No, Henry Miller, the man whose blueprints had saved cities from collapse, was now building another plan, not for salvation, but for destruction, thin and cold as a steel frame, calculated to the millimeter. He didn't know what he wanted in the end: revenge, justice, or just the truth that would wash this pain away like rain washes dust off the deserted roads of Phoenix, but he knew he had to be ready, and to do that he needed proof as irrefutable as the formulas in his engineering calculations, so that when the time came, neither Becky nor Matt could weasel out of it the way they had for months, maybe years, hiding their secrets behind smiles and neighborhood barbecues. He walked into the house through the back door, trying not to make any noise, even though the silence in the house was so thick it seemed to hum like live wires. Becky was in the kitchen. He heard the clink of dishes and the smell of something spicy, probably her signature taco sauce, the one she made when she wanted to please him or just take her mind off her own thoughts. Henry paused in the doorway, looking at her. Her brown hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, her slender neck tilted slightly as she chopped onions, and her dress, simple but flattering her figure, the one he loved to cuddle at night when they fell asleep together, thinking their life was a fortress that nothing could ever disturb. Now he saw her not as a wife, but as a riddle to be solved, and his heart sank at the duality of love, which still smoldered like coals in a cold fire, and anger, which burned like the Arizona sun at noon. "Honey, are you back?" Becky turned, wiping her hands on her cactus-embroidered apron, and her smile was cautious, like someone walking on thin ice that could crack at any moment. "I thought you were going to see Matt. You always talk about something after golf. Do you want me to make you some coffee? Or maybe we can grab dinner early. I'm making tacos, your favorite, with that sauce you raved about last time." Henry forced a smile, though it was like wearing a mask that was pinching his temples, and stepped toward her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders, feeling her body tense for a moment before relaxing in his arms. "That sounds great, honey," he said, his voice smooth as the asphalt of their street, unbroken, even though inside he was seething like lava under the desert crust. I was in the garage, sorting through some old tools. Maybe we could have Matt and Pam over for dinner. It's been a while, and you know how I like it when we're all together, just like old times. She nodded, her eyes, still beautiful, but now tinged with guilt, sliding over his face as if searching for a catch. But then her smile widened, as if she believed he wanted peace, not war. That's a good idea, Henry. I'll call Pam and see if they're free. Matt always enjoys your company, you know. He says you're his best golf partner, even if you sometimes miss the coyote hole. She laughed, but it was as brittle as the glass he'd broken in the garage, and Henry felt his fists curl in the pockets of his jeans, but he just nodded, still smiling. Call me, he said, going to the sink to pour water, but really to hide the look that might give him away. I'm going to go to the garage and check one thing. Be right back, honey. He walked out, feeling her eyes following him, and each step was part of a plan he had already begun to build in his head, like an engineer designing not a bridge, but a trap, where every detail must be in its place. In the garage, he looked again at the broken glass, its shards still lying on the floor, and at Becky's old phone, which he had hidden in a drawer on the workbench, so she wouldn't find it by accident. He knew that the phone and Pam's printouts alone weren't enough, they were evidence, but they weren't a system, and Henry was a systems man, a man who believed in taming chaos with the right loads. He pulled out his laptop, plugged it into an outlet hidden behind boxes of Christmas decorations, and started searching the internet. Cameras. Small, hidden ones, with Wi-Fi so they would record straight to his cloud. He found a model that could be installed in an hour, with high resolution and night vision, because if Becky and Matt were meeting in that garage and the smell of that musky perfume and the glass of red lipstick suggested he wanted to catch them like animals in a trap, with evidence that couldn't be disputed. While the order was being processed, delivery was scheduled for the following day. He began gathering other materials. Statements from their joint bank account, which he could pull online to check for any expenses in Sedona or anywhere else Becky hadn't mentioned. He remembered the time she'd returned from a grocery shopping trip with a new dress she'd said was on sale, but he'd never seen the receipt, and the dress was too expensive for their budget, where every dollar counted. He'd also downloaded an app to recover deleted messages from messaging apps, not just from Becky's phone, but from his own. He knew that one wrong move could cause his plan to collapse like a poorly designed bridge under too much weight, so he proceeded methodically, step by step, like an engineer checking every detail before handing over a project. He downloaded the app to his phone and connected it to the cloud, so he could access the data in real time once the camera was installed. Then he checked their home security system, the one they'd installed a couple of years ago after a petty theft at a neighbor's house. The cameras on the front door and in the yard only covered the outside perimeter, but there was no camera in the garage. Becky had always said there was no need for one there, that it was just a storage area for tools and old boxes, and Henry had agreed without thinking, but now her insistence on the matter felt like another piece of the puzzle he was assembling with painful precision. He found an old hard drive from the security system, connected it to his laptop, and began reviewing the footage for the past months, looking for any clues. Matt's car parked too close to their house at an odd time, Becky leaving late at night without an explanation. In one recording, he saw Becky leaving her house on a Thursday night, wearing the same low-cut dress he had deemed too dressy for the supermarket, and getting into a car, not their family sedan, but a taxi that drove off toward the city, not to her art class, as she had claimed. That was 3 months ago, and the timing matched one of M's texts, which mentioned meeting at a bar in downtown Phoenix. Henry felt a cold determination building inside him, like steel tempered in fire. He wasn't going to make a scene, not now, not until his trap was ready. He knew that emotion was a weakness, like a crack in a structure that could lead to collapse, so he held himself together, just as he did at work when clients demanded the impossible, and he found a solution because he was always a problem solver. He went back into the house, splashed cold water on his face to wash the sweat and tension from his face, and put on a clean shirt, getting ready for the dinner with Matt and Pam that Becky had organized while he was in the garage. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, at his blue eyes that Becky had once called like the sky over the desert, and saw in them not pain but calculation, as if he were designing not a bridge, but a weapon that would hit its target. The evening passed in a blur. Matt and Pam arrived around 7, with a bottle of wine and Pam's bowl of her signature corn and avocado salad, always a hit at their get-togethers. Matt was the center of attention, as always, his voice booming as he told a story about a client who wanted a house with a star-shaped pool, and Pam sat nearby, smiling quietly, but with her eyes watching, as always, and Henry caught her eye a couple of times, feeling like she was seeing through his plan, his reserve, the way an X-ray sees bone beneath his skin. Becky was surprisingly animated, laughing at Matt's jokes, refilling his glass, and only once, as she handed him a plate of tacos, did her hand shake and the sauce dripped onto the tablecloth like blood, reminding him of that red lipstick on the glass. He smiled at her, softly, as if nothing had changed, and even hugged her before the guests left, whispering, "I love you, darling," although the words were like sand in his mouth, dry and bitter. "You're a little quiet today, Henry," Matt remarked, clapping him on the shoulder as they stood at the door to see the Randalls out. "You okay? Or is it your bridges at work that are getting on your nerves? Tell me, brother, you know I'm always here to listen." His smile was as wide as ever, but now Henry saw something predatory in it, like a coyote stalking in the night, and he just nodded, saying, "Yeah, just tired, Matt. Work, you know, same as always. But it's okay, I'll see you at the next round. Let's figure out a way to beat that coyote hole, huh?" Matt laughed, his hand lingering on Henry's shoulder a little too long, and Henry felt his skin burn beneath the touch, but he just smiled back, like an engineer who knows the foundation has been laid, and now all that's left is to wait. The next day, the camera arrived, small and unnoticeable, the size of a lighter, with instructions that Henry mastered in half an hour, thanks to his experience with technology. He set it up in the garage, hidden behind an old box of Christmas lights, the lens angled to capture the entire workbench and the entryway. He checked the app on his phone, the image was clear, the audio was recording, and the data was going straight to the cloud, where Becky couldn't find it even if she wanted to. He also pulled their bank statements for the past 2 years, looking for any unusual spending hotels, restaurants, clothing stores that might have had the dresses or lipstick he'd found. He found several transactions, a small hotel in Sedona, a restaurant in downtown Phoenix, even a flower shop, though Becky hadn't brought home flowers in months. Each receipt was another nail in his plan, strengthening the structure he'd been building with cold precision. Henry didn't know when his trap would spring, but he was willing to wait a day, a week, a month, whatever it took. He imagined seeing them on tape, Becky and Matt, in his garage, smelling of her new perfume, stained with her red lipstick, and the image was like a blueprint he had in his head, perfect and destructive. He didn't make a scene, didn't yell, didn't break furniture like others would have. Instead, he had dinner with Becky, laughed with Matt, hugged Pam goodbye, knowing that she was his ally, however unwitting, in this dance of shadows. Inside, he was an engineer, building not a bridge but a trap, and when it snapped shut, no one could deny the truth, just as no one could deny gravity when the bridge collapsed. Henry stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom, adjusting his tie, the navy blue one with the delicate diamond pattern that Becky had given him for their last anniversary, back when they'd still laughed about how fast time was flying and drank wine in the backyard, looking at the stars above Phoenix that seemed as eternal as their love. Now the tie was part of his mask, like the smile he'd practiced in front of his reflection, where his eyes, usually as clear as the Arizona sky, were now as shadowed as before a sandstorm. Today was their 21st wedding anniversary, and Henry had thrown a party at the golf club where he and Matt had spent so many Saturdays, arguing holes and drinking beer in the shade of the palms. He invited everyone, colleagues from the engineering firm, neighbors from Cactus Ridge, old college friends who had driven up from Tucson, and, of course, Matt and Pam, whose names he had written on the guest list with the cold precision of an engineer calculating the load on a bridge before testing it. This was his stage, his moment, and he was going to strike the first blow not with a club to a ball, but with a truth that would rip apart their perfect suburban mirage like lightning splitting dry wood. Becky was in the bathroom, putting the finishing touches on her makeup, the same neutral shade of lipstick she always wore for formal occasions, to look natural, though Henry now knew that somewhere in her purse, hidden among her keys and receipts, was the red lipstick he'd found on the glass in the garage. She came out, smiling, wearing a dress the color of a desert sunset peach and flowing, with a neckline that was more modest than the one she wore for meeting her girlfriends, but still showed off her figure, which, despite everything, still made his heart ache with a mixture of love and pain. "Are you ready, honey?" she asked, her voice soft but with a slight tremor, as if she sensed that this evening would be more than just a celebration. "You've been putting so much effort into this party, I still can't believe you did it all by yourself. Even Matt said it was going to be great. He called yesterday asking if I should bring anything other than my charm." She laughed, but it was as fragile as glass, and Henry noticed her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her dress. "It's all under control, honey," he said, smiling as if nothing had changed, although inside he felt like he was about to hit a difficult shot at Coyote, where the wind always seemed to want to blow the ball into the bunker. "I want to make this a night to remember. It's our anniversary, Becky. 21 years is no joke. Let's make it something people will talk about for a long time." He took her hand, feeling the coolness of her skin against his fingers, and led her to the car, where the truck was waiting, shiny from its wash, as if it, too, was part of his plan to look perfect until everything fell apart. Sandstar Golf Club was decorated with the elegant simplicity that Phoenix loved. Strands of warm white lights hung over an outdoor patio where tables were covered in white tablecloths, each centered with a vase of succulents, a nod to the desert surrounding the oasis. Guests were already arriving, their laughter and the clink of glasses mingling with the soft jazz playing on the speakers and the smell of roasting meat from the grill the club had provided for the event. Henry watched as his colleagues, serious engineers in suits, joked with neighbors whose faces were familiar from barbecues and school assemblies. Matt and Pam were among the first to arrive, he in his usual expensive jacket, with a smile that could sell a house in the desert, and she in a simple green dress that made her look like part of her garden, with the same quiet watchfulness in her eyes that Henry now saw as a sign of her knowledge, her silent complicity. "Henry, man, this is just gorgeous." Matt came over, clapping him on the shoulder with a familiarity that now seemed as venomous to Henry as a rattlesnake bite. "You've outdone yourself, bro. 21 is like a one putt on the 18th hole, right? Becky, you've got it down pat, that's for sure." He winked at her, and Henry saw her cheeks flush slightly, but she quickly turned away, pretending to straighten the flowers on a nearby table. Pam, standing next to him, looked at Henry with the same mixture of sadness and determination in her eyes that he'd seen in her kitchen when she'd given him the printouts, and he knew she knew something was going to happen today, even if she didn't know what. "Thank you, Matt," Henry said, his voice as smooth as a granite countertop, and he raised his wine glass to clink. "This is for all of us, for our friendship, for our family, for everything we've built together in this suburb. Let's make this an unforgettable night." He smiled, but his eyes were as cold as the concrete in their garage, and he saw Pam's lips pressed together slightly, as if holding back the words that might spill out. The evening went on, guests eating, drinking, dancing to slow tunes, and Henry played the role of the perfect host, going around the tables, shaking hands, laughing at his colleagues' jokes about his meticulousness in the drawings, and teasing Matt about his recent blunder in the field. Becky was close by, her hand occasionally touching his elbow, as if seeking support, but he could feel her fingers trembling and saw her avoiding long eye contact, as if she were afraid he would read in her eyes a truth she had already partially revealed. He waited, like an engineer who knows that the load on a structure must be distributed evenly to hold it, and his moment was approaching, like the shadow of a palm tree lengthening toward sunset. As the sun set and the terrace glowed warmly with fairy lights, Henry took the microphone from the large screen he had asked to be installed for a family slideshow. The guests fell silent, smiling, waiting for touching memories, and Becky, standing next to him, squeezed his hand, her smile taut as a string about to snap. "Friends, thank you for coming to share this evening with us," he began, his voice loud but warm, as if he were actually celebrating rather than bracing for a blow. 21 years with Becky is a lifetime of laughter, tears, victories, and mistakes, and I want to show you a little of our journey, because you are all part of our story, our home, our family. He nodded to the club technician, and the screen lit up. The first slides were innocent, their wedding in a small chapel in Phoenix, with Becky shining like a star in a white dress and him, young and awkward, looking on adoringly. Holly's birth, with them holding the tiny bundle in the hospital room. Their trip to the Grand Canyon, with Becky laughing and the wind blowing through her hair. The guests were touched, some clapping, some wiping away a tear, remembering his own moments, while others raised their glasses, whispering toasts to their love. Henry stood next to Becky, feeling her hand on his elbow grow colder, as if she sensed that these warm images were just the foundation for what he was about to build. The screen flickered, casting a soft light on the faces of the guests gathered on the terrace of Sand Star Golf Club, where the air was thick with the smell of grilled meats, jasmine from the clubhouse garden, and the anticipation of something more than just nostalgia. Matt sat at one of the front tables, his wide smile set in stone, as if he was sure that this evening was just another chapter of their friendship, where he, as always, would get away with it. Pam, next to him, held a glass of wine but did not drink, her eyes, dark and deep as wells in the desert, watching Henry, and he knew she was waiting, holding her breath, like a person who sees a storm coming but cannot stop the wind. 21 years is not just a number, Henry continued, his voice even but with that subtle steel that comes when an engineer knows the calculations are right and the structure will withstand any load. They are years of trust, support, moments that make us family. But you know, family is not only love, it is also true, even when it cuts like a cactus thorn. And today I want to share with you not only our happy memories, but also the truth, which, as I have recently realized, is more important than anything. The guests began to murmur, their smiles a little tighter, as if they sensed the tone of the evening shifting, like the sky before a storm. Becky squeezed his hand tighter, her nails digging into the skin, and she whispered, so quietly only he could hear, "Henry, what are you doing? It's just a slideshow, right? Just our pictures, right?" Her voice shook like a leaf in the wind, and he turned to her, smiling so softly it would have fooled anyone but Pam, who knew there was a storm behind that smile. "Sure, honey," he said, also whispering, but his eyes were as cold as the concrete in their garage. "Just a photo, and a little more. Relax, this is our night." He nodded to the technician, and the next slide appeared on the screen, not their wedding, not Holly in a baby suit, but a screenshot of a text message. The text was large and clear, and the words glowed on the screen like a torch in the night. M. Sedona this weekend. Same hotel, Canyon View Room. B. I'm not sure Henry will be home, but I'll think about it. M. You always think and then come. I know you can't resist. The room froze. Someone coughed, someone set a glass down on the table with a soft clink, but the silence was such that even the wind in the palm trees beyond the terrace seemed to have died down. Becky gasped, her hand slipping from his grasp, and she took a step back, her face as white as sand under the moon. "Henry," she whispered, her voice full of panic. "What is this? Where did this come from? You shouldn't have." "Wait, honey, this is just the beginning," Henry said, his voice louder now, but still calm, as if he were reading a technical report to an engineers meeting. "I want everyone to see what real family is, real friendship. Because I trusted you like you trust a bridge you built, but it turns out the foundation was rotten." He nodded to the technician, and the next slide appeared, another screenshot of him writing, "Your dress yesterday, damn Becky, you know how to drive me crazy." And she was replying, "Stop it, you talk too much. But thank you." Matt, who had been sitting at the table, stood up abruptly, his chair creaking on the wooden deck floor, and his face, usually flushed from the sun and wine, turned ashen. "Henry, what the hell?" he barked, his voice, usually loud and confident, now shaking as if he were trying to hold up a falling building. Is this a joke? You hacked someone's phone? This is not funny, bro. Turn it off right now. A joke? Henry turned to him, and his smile disappeared, replaced by a cold stare that was like the steel in his blueprints, hard, unyielding. No, Matt, it's not a joke. It's the truth, which I found on Becky's old phone in the garage, which, by the way, smelled like your cologne, the same one you use when you go to sell houses to rich Californians. And you know, I didn't want to believe that my best friend, my brother, as you like to say, could stab me in the back. But here's the evidence, and you can't argue with it, just like you can't argue with gravity when a bridge collapses. The guests began to whisper, some turning away, some looking at Becky, who was now standing with her hands clasped to her chest, her eyes full of tears, her lips trembling as if she were trying to find the words, but they were stuck like sand in her throat. "Henry, please," she managed, her voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "No, not here, not in front of everyone. I asked you, I wanted to talk, to explain, I didn't mean for this to happen. I swear it was a mistake. I love you, you know that." "Love?" Henry turned to her, his voice rising but not shouting, because he was an engineer, a man in control, even when the world was falling apart. "Love isn't a lie, Becky. Love isn't the meetings in Sedona, the texts about how you can't resist. Love isn't the glass of red lipstick in our garage, the dress you wore for him, not for me. You said you loved me, but every time you smiled at me, cooked me dinner, slept next to me, you lied. And I want everyone here to know that our perfect life, our perfect marriage, is a mirage, like an oasis in the desert that disappears the closer you get." The screen flickered, and there was video now, grainy, taken by the hidden camera Henry had set up in the garage just 3 days ago, after finding Pam's phone and printouts. It showed Becky walking into the garage late at night, Matt following her, his hand on her waist, and she laughing, quietly, but with a sparkle Henry hadn't seen in her eyes in years. They said something, too quiet for the microphone, but then Matt pulled her close, and their lips met in a kiss, brief, but so intimate that the room gasped as if lightning had finally struck the storm. And then the final blow. A photo taken from the camera of Becky sitting on the workbench, her dress hiked up, and Matt standing between her legs, his hands on her hips, and it wasn't just a betrayal, it was an image that burned every last vestige of illusion out of Henry's head. Becky screamed, her voice cutting through the silence like a coyote in the night. "Henry, turn it off. Please, I'm begging you. It's not what you think. I didn't mean to. It was a mistake. I was confused. I was lonely. You were always at work and I just wanted to feel alive." She lunged at him, but he retreated, his face as stony as the rocks in Sedona she'd written about in those texts. "Lonely?" he asked, and now there was a crack in his voice, like the earth after a drought. "I worked, Becky, so we could have this house, this life, so Holly could go to college, so we could dream of that trip to Italy you always talked about. And you found a life with him, with my best friend, in our garage, in our house, raising our daughter." Matt stepped forward, his face as red as the sunset, his hands raised as if trying to stop a storm. "Henry, look, it's not what you think," he began, his voice loud but with a hint of panic, like a man who knows he's been caught. "It was, hell, it was a time, maybe two, just a weakness. We're all human, brother. You know how it is when life gets routine. I didn't mean to ruin your marriage. I swear it was nothing. Just a moment, like sand in the desert blowing away in the wind." "Nothing." Henry turned to him, his voice now louder, like thunder. 2 years, Matt. 2 years of lies, meetings, texts, trips to Sedona. You call that nothing? You were my friend, my brother. You baptized my daughter, and then you slept with my wife in my house. And you dare stand here and say this is just a moment? The guests were silent, some looking away, others watching in horror, as if they had witnessed an accident they couldn't tear themselves away from. Henry's co-workers, accustomed to his calm and logic, looked at each other, unsure of how to react. The neighbors, who knew them as a perfect couple, whispered, covering their mouths with their hands. And Pam. Pam sat like an ice statue, her face motionless, but her eyes blazing with the same determination Henry had seen in her kitchen when she had given him the printouts. She didn't say a word, but her silence was louder than Becky's screams, louder than Matt's excuses, and Henry knew she wasn't surprised, that she had been expecting this, like someone who knew a storm was coming. Pam, Henry turned to her, his voice quieter, but with strength, like a foundation that can support any weight. You knew. You gave me those letters. You opened my eyes. Tell them, tell everyone that you knew, that you kept quiet to protect your son, but now the truth is here, and I want them to hear it from you. Pam stood slowly, her movements fluid, like a woman who had long ago accepted her pain and learned to live with it. She looked at Matt, then at Becky, and finally at the guests, and her voice when she spoke was quiet but cutting like a knife. I knew, she said, and each word was like a hammer hitting a nail. 2 years ago, I found their letters, their plans, their secrets. I kept quiet for Chris, my son, because I didn't want him to know that his father was not a hero, but a man who had succumbed to weakness. I kept quiet for our family, for you, Henry, because I thought it would pass, that it was just a desert storm. But I was wrong, and when you came to me, I gave you those letters, because the truth had to come out like water from the ground. I'm not proud of my silence, but I'm here, and I stand by every word Henry said. Matt and Becky betrayed us, and I'm tired of being silent. Matt turned to face her, his face twisted as if he'd been punched. Pam, you gave him the letters. You betrayed me. After everything we've been through, you just ruin our family. His voice broke, and he took a step toward her, but she held up a hand, stopping him like a wall. I didn't, Matt, she said, her voice as cold as the desert night. You did it yourself. You and Becky. I protected Chris, but he's an adult now, and he deserves the truth, as does Henry, as do I. You thought you could live in two worlds, ours and theirs, but the truth always finds a way, like sand that seeps through every crack. Becky sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs, and she repeated like a mantra, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, I didn't know how to stop. The guests began to leave, some quietly, some with awkward apologies, realizing that this evening had become not a celebration, but a trial. Matt stood, looking from Henry to Pam, his hands clenched into fists, but he didn't know what to say, as if the words he always juggled so deftly were now scattered like sand. Pam walked over to Henry, put her hand on his shoulder, and said quietly, You did what you had to do. Now decide what to do next. I'm here if you need me. Henry nodded, feeling empty inside, as if a storm had passed, leaving only the destruction. He looked at Becky, who was now crying into the tablecloth, and at Matt, who was trying to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the departing guests. The screen was still glowing, showing that last shot of Becky and Matt in the garage, silhouetted like ghosts who had destroyed his world. He didn't know what would happen next, divorce, forgiveness, or just going into the desert where he could forget it all, like a mirage. But he knew one thing for sure. His trap had worked, and the truth had struck like lightning, right on target, leaving behind only ashes and silence. The silence that followed the golf club party wasn't just silence, it was the calm after a sandstorm, when the dust settles to reveal a devastation that's impossible to ignore. Fallen trees, broken windows, signs of chaos that can't be covered by more sand. Henry was in his office, the small room on the second floor of their Cactus Ridge house, where he usually drew bridges, measuring every angle, every bolt, to make sure they would support any weight. Now he had papers in front of him. Instead of Blueprint's legal forms he'd downloaded from a Phoenix courthouse website, and a folder of evidence he'd collected over the past weeks. Printouts of emails from Pam, screenshots of text messages from Becky's phone, footage from the security camera in the garage, bank statements where each transaction, the hotel in Sedona, the restaurant downtown, the flowers that had never arrived, was a nail in the coffin of their marriage. He looked at these papers, and his heart, which had once beat in the rhythm of their life together, now beat steadily, coldly, like a metronome counting the steps to the inevitable end. Becky hadn't left her bedroom since the night before. After the guests had left, Leaving the golf course terrace empty and the air heavy with awkwardness and whispers, she had collapsed into a chair, sobbing, begging Henry to listen, to explain, to give her a chance. But he had looked at her the way an engineer looks at a bridge that has already cracked, knowing that no amount of patching will save it. "I'm going to file for divorce, Becky," he had said then, his voice quiet, but as hard as the concrete he had so often tested. "I can't live with a lie. Not after what I've seen, what happened. You've ruined us, and I can't pretend it didn't happen." She tried to grab his hand, but he retreated, leaving her alone among the white tablecloths and fading garlands, and walked home, leaving his pickup truck at the club because he couldn't sit next to her in a car soaked in her perfume and his pain. Now, sitting at his desk, he filled out forms for the court, his hand moving methodically as if calculating the load on a girder. He knew he wanted full custody of Holly, their daughter, who had just started college in Tucson, didn't know the whole truth yet, but Henry was determined to protect her the way he would protect a bridge from being overloaded. He called his lawyer, an old friend from college, Mark, who specialized in family law, and promised to meet him tomorrow to file the case. "With your evidence, Henry, this is an ironclad case," Mark said over the phone, his voice businesslike but tinged with sympathy. "The text messages, the videos, the financial trail, the judge will see that Becky is unstable, especially after you tell us about her behavior at the party. Custody of Holly is almost guaranteed if you insist. But are you sure? Divorce is like tearing down a house you spent years building. Maybe you should try therapy." "No, Mark," Henry said, looking at the photo of Holly on the table, smiling at graduation, her eyes shining with a hope he didn't want to take away. "This house has already fallen down. I'm just cleaning up the rubble." He hung up and continued filling out forms, feeling like each line was a step toward a new life, one where there would be no lies, but perhaps also no warmth like he'd once found in Becky's arms. Becky, meanwhile, was on edge. He could hear her crying in the bedroom, sometimes calling out his name, sometimes whispering apologies that sank into the silence of the house like stones in a dry riverbed. Once she came downstairs, her face puffy, her eyes red, her hair disheveled as if she were trying to wring her guilt out of it. "Henry, please talk to me," she begged, standing in the doorway of the study, her hands shaking like leaves in the wind before a storm. "I know what I did. I know I broke everything, but I didn't mean to, I swear. It wasn't me. It was weakness, loneliness, confusion. But I love you. I always have. Don't do this. Don't ruin us, for Holly, for what we had." Henry looked at her, and for a moment he wanted to hold her, like he used to when she cried over little things, a broken vase, a bad day. But then he remembered the video of her laughing with Matt in their garage, her hands on his shoulders, her lips leaving traces of red lipstick, and his heart turned to steel again. "Becky," he said, his voice cold as concrete in the shadows, "you destroyed us, not me. You chose Matt, you chose lies, you chose Sedona over our family. I can't forgive that, and Holly shouldn't have to live with a mother who lies like she breathes. I'm going to file for divorce, and I'm taking Holly because she deserves stability, and you're on the edge, and I can't trust you with even myself, much less our daughter." She fell to her knees, sobbing, but he didn't come over to her, didn't help her up, just closed the office door, as if cutting off the last link to the life he'd been happy in. He knew Becky was on the verge of a breakdown, and it scared him, but not enough to stop him. He sent copies of all the evidence to Mark, knowing that the judge would see not only the infidelity, but also her emotional instability, which showed in her hysterics, in her inability to control herself at the party when the truth came out like sand after the wind. But his plan didn't stop with divorce. Matt, the man he once called brother, had to pay not only for betraying their friendship, but for destroying his family. Henry knew Matt was gearing up for a big deal, the sale of a luxury home in Scottsdale, a deal that could earn him a six-figure commission and enhance his reputation at the real estate firm where he was a star. Henry, an engineer accustomed to precision, found a way to strike. He had connections in the construction industry, and he knew one of the partners at Matt's firm, Richard, a man who valued integrity and reputation more than money. Henry assembled a dossier, the same email printouts, screenshots, CCTV footage, and included a letter describing how Matt had used his charm and connections to deceive not only his friends, but his clients as well, manipulating the details of deals to make himself appear more successful. It wasn't exactly true, but Henry knew that the shadow of a doubt could ruin a career faster than facts. He sent the dossier to Richard with a short letter. "This man is not trustworthy. Look what he did to my family. Don't let him ruin your reputation." The next day, Richard called. "Henry, I got your letter," he said, his voice heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of someone else's pain. "I can't believe Matt would do this, but the evidence, it's overwhelming. The Scottsdale deal is off, at least not with him, and I'm going to talk to the board, maybe get him removed. It's dirty, Henry, but I understand why you did it. I'm sorry about your family." Henry thanked him, feeling something click inside him, like a trap that had snapped shut, trapping Matt with no way out without loss. Meanwhile, Pam, the quiet woman who always seemed like Matt's shadow, had made her move too. Henry found out when he stopped by her place a few days after the party to return a folder of printouts. She was sitting in her garden, among the roses and succulents that now seemed like the only thing left of her old life. Her face was calm, but her eyes were steely, like someone who had finally thrown off her chains. "I left Matt," she said, watering the flowers with a small watering can, her voice as smooth as the surface of her pool on a windless day. "I packed up yesterday while he was at the office, trying to salvage that deal you seem to have taken care of. I sold his boat, the one he loved so much, the one he called his freedom. Got enough for it to rent an apartment in Tucson, closer to Chris. This isn't revenge, Henry. This is payback for all those years I stayed silent while he destroyed us. I called Chris, told him the truth. He was shocked, but he said he wanted to see me, not him. Matt was alone, and it was his choice, not mine." Henry looked at her, feeling a strange respect for this woman who, like him, had been caught in the middle of a storm but had found the strength to rise above it. "You're a good girl, Pam," he said, sitting down on the bench next to her where they often drank coffee in the mornings and discussed neighborhood gossip. "I was afraid you'd stay with him, endure it the way you've endured it for years, but you're stronger than I thought." She smiled, but it was sad, like a sunset over the desert. "Strength isn't always about shouting, Henry," she said, setting down the watering can and looking at her roses, which were blooming despite the heat. "Sometimes it's just about walking away, leaving behind what's destroying you. I kept quiet for Chris, but now he's an adult, and I'm free. What about you? What are you going to do? You got what you wanted, the divorce, the custody, the blow to Matt. But what now? You're not the kind of person who lives for revenge." Henry thought, looking at the house across the street, where he now lived alone, because Becky had gone to live with her sister in Flagstaff, taking only a bag of clothes and a note that said, "I can't stay here. I'm sorry about everything." He thought about Holly, who would have to tell the truth, how to explain to her that her mother and godfather had betrayed their family. He thought about his work, where the bridges he had built still stood strong, unlike his life. "I don't know, Pam," he said finally, his voice as quiet as the wind whispering through a canyon. "Maybe I'll start over. Maybe I'll move, find a new project, a new city. But first I have to make sure Holly is okay. She's my ultimate calculation, my ultimate bridge. And revenge, it doesn't feel as warm as I thought it would. It's like building a bridge that goes nowhere." They sat in the garden until the sun began to set, painting the sky crimson and gold, and Henry felt that despite the pain, despite the broken marriage and friendship, he had done what he had to do. His traps had worked, the division of property had begun, not just the house and the bills, but the truth that now lay between them all like a desert where everyone must find their way. It had been 6 months since that night at the golf club, when the truth had ripped through the sky like lightning over their suburban life, leaving behind only ashes and a silence that could never be filled, like a desert where the wind carried away even the memory of rain. Henry sat on the porch of his house on Cactus Ridge, looking out over the empty street where children had once played, but now only palm trees swayed in the rare evening breeze, casting long shadows like scars in the sand. The house that had once been full of Becky's laughter and Holly's screams and the smell of her signature taco sauce was now too big for one person, its walls holding echoes of a past that Henry had tried to rebuild like an engineer fixing a collapsed bridge. But the bridges he built at work were simpler blueprints and formulas and steel and concrete, whereas here in his life, everything was as elusive as a mirage in the desert that vanished the moment you tried to touch it. Holly went off to college in Tucson, where she studied biology, dreaming of becoming an ecologist and saving the desert she had loved so much since she was a child. Henry told her the truth, not all of it, not about the garage and the red lipstick, but enough that she understood why her mother had left, why their family, which had seemed as solid as the cliffs of the Grand Canyon, was crumbling like sand in the wind. She cried in his arms and asked him why adults made life so difficult. But then, like an 18-year-old, she pulled herself together, wiped her tears, and said, "Dad, I can do this, and you can do this. You build bridges that don't fall. Build one for yourself." Her words were a beacon in the night, and Henry held on to them when the loneliness rolled in like the heat at noon. Becky left Phoenix shortly after the judge signed the divorce papers. With the evidence Henry had collected screenshots, videos, printouts from Pam, the case was settled. He was awarded full custody of Holly, and Becky, whose tantrums in court had only confirmed her instability, did not contest the decision, as if she knew she had lost the right to fight. She moved in with her sister in Flagstaff, leaving Henry with the house, the car, and most of their savings, as if she wanted to erase herself from his life like footprints in the sand. She called Holly occasionally, but the conversations were brief, filled with awkward silences, and Henry knew that their daughter, though she loved her mother, could not forgive her for the betrayal that had torn their family apart. He didn't know if he missed Becky or the woman she used to be, the one who had laughed at their wedding, danced with him under the stars, picked out bedspreads at the store in Mesa. Now she was like a mirage he'd seen in the desert but couldn't touch. Matt, his former best friend, the man whose charisma had once lit up their get-togethers like the sun on a desert, was now a shadow of his former self. After Henry sent the dossier to the real estate agent, the Scottsdale deal had fallen through, and Matt's reputation, built over the years, had cracked like dry earth. He had been sidelined from major projects, and rumors of his infidelity had spread like sand across Phoenix, where suburban gossip was as relentless as the heat. Henry had heard from neighbors that Matt had started drinking not beer at barbecues, but something stronger, alone in his house, now empty without Pam and without their son Chris, who refused to talk to his father after learning the truth. Henry didn't feel the joy of it, as he had once thought when he planned his trap. Revenge was like a bridge leading to nowhere. You build it, spend your energy, and then you stand on the edge and realize that it connects nothing but emptiness. He looked across the street at the Randall house, where the curtains were no longer perfectly clean and the lawn was starting to grow weeds, and he thought that the life they had all been building, he, Becky, Matt, Pam, was like a blueprint that had looked perfect on paper, but was collapsing under the weight of reality. The sun was setting, painting the sky crimson and gold, and Henry felt the loneliness of the desert settle over him, like the desert heat that suffocates instead of warms him. He thought about selling the house, about moving away from Phoenix, maybe to Colorado, where the mountains and the coolness might give him a new start, but for now he stayed here, tied to this place like an engineer to a project that is not yet finished. And then he heard footsteps, light but sure, as if someone knew he was expected. He looked up and saw Pam coming up the path toward his porch. She was holding a bottle of wine, a Cabernet, his favorite, with the deep flavor he always praised at their dinners together. She was wearing a simple dress, the color of sand, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, and her face, though tired, had the quiet strength he had begun to see in her kitchen when she had given him the printouts that had opened his eyes. She paused at the steps and smiled, and there was none of the silent patience he had seen before in her smile, only the freedom of someone who has shed a load and is now walking light. "I figured you liked Cabernet, too," she said, raising the bottle, her voice soft as an evening breeze, but with a hint of warmth he hadn't heard in a long time. "I'm in Tucson now, renting an apartment not far from Chris, but I came to pick up the last of my things from the house. I figured I couldn't leave without having a glass with you, for old times' sake, or new if you prefer." Henry looked at her, feeling something inside him stir, like a weak shoot pushing through the sand after a rare rain. He stood up, took the bottle from her hands, and their fingers brushed briefly, cool from the glass, but warm from something else he hadn't expected to feel. "Yes," he said, smiling for the first time in months, his voice rough but sincere, "especially when it doesn't taste like betrayal." Pam laughed, and hers was like desert bells, light but alive. "Here's to another drink, then," she said, walking up the steps and sitting next to him on the wooden bench where they'd once drank coffee in the morning, discussing neighborhood gossip or barbecue plans. "To a fresh start, no lies, no shadows. Just us and the wine and this damn desert that's still beautiful, despite everything." Henry got 2 glasses from the kitchen, poured wine, and clinked them together, the sound as clear as a star in the night sky. The wine was tart, with notes of blackcurrant and oak, and it warmed him like the hope he had almost lost. They sat in silence, watching the sunset, turning Phoenix into a painting, each hue a promise of a new day. Henry didn't know what would happen next, whether he would stay in this house, find a new project, a new love, or simply live for Holly, for her smile, which was his main bridge. But in that moment, with Pam by his side, wine in hand, the desert before him, he felt like he had hit the mark, not in golf, not in revenge, but in a life where, after destruction, you can begin to rebuild, one step at a time, like a bridge across a canyon. They talked until midnight about Chris, who had found a new job at a startup, about Holly, who had sent Henry a photo of a cactus she'd saved from the university garden, about the desert, which had always been their home, despite the pain. Pam told them about selling Matt's boat, and they laughed, not angrily, but with the ease that comes with letting go. "That was my last shot," she said, looking up at the stars. "I'm free now, Henry. Are you?" "I'm learning," he replied, his voice soft as the sand beneath his feet. "Learning to build bridges for myself." When she was gone, leaving behind the empty bottle and the warmth of her presence, Henry stood on the porch, looking up at the sky, where the stars shone like blueprints for a new life. The ending was open, like a desert, where every trail could lead to a new path. But tonight it was warm, like a glass of Cabernet shared with someone who understood his pain and his hope. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.